Welcome to episode 7 of Children's Pedcast. I'm Jimmy Bellamy, and this week's guest is Dex Tuttle, the Injury Prevention Program Coordinator at Children's Hospitals and Clinics of Minnesota. We talk about car seat safety in this episode, and it's a topic that's important to all parents and caregivers. There are a lot of questions when it comes to car seats. Which one do I get? How do I know that my vehicle is right for this car seat? Should I get a front-facing seat? Should I get a rear-facing seat? When is it okay to have a booster seat? Dex answers any and all questions about car seat safety. He's a fountain of knowledge when it comes to injury prevention and keeping kids safe. We know that you have a lot of questions, and we answer them here in this episode. Doing this gig?
I've been at Children's for coming up on 2 years now.
And how did you get into this line of work when it comes to injury prevention?
Well, it's a bit of a long story, so let me see if I can shorten it down for you.
Give us the abridged version.
Yeah.
You could take as long as you need, Dex.
Prior to working in healthcare, I worked in higher education where I did a lot of event planning and worked with students and leadership programs. And then decided I needed a change of pace, so I went and got trained as an EMT, and I moved up to Minneapolis here to St. Paul and worked at another hospital in their emergency department for a few years. Through the connections I made there, I was told about this position, which kind of meshed those two worlds together, healthcare and event planning, and it was a great fit, so here I am.
A lot of people have questions about car seats. It's something that impacts anyone who's going to be a parent, unless you're not driving a car.
Yeah.
But even so, a lot of times if you're a parent not driving a car, chances are you'll have relatives or family friends who will be taking your kids for any number of reasons on trips or appointments. If you're a first-time parent, and I want you to speak from your experience as well as a parent, because I can't, how do you navigate your way through all of the, whether it's advertisements or options, brands? How do you know what to get when it comes to a child seat as an expectant parent?
Well, I tell you, it's tricky. And so if you look at the data around the nation in terms of the car seat checkup events that we have, we collect data on how people are using their seats. 90% of seats are misused in some way or another. And there's a good reason for that. They're confusing. And it's hard to know what's the right way to install the seat. It's hard to know what seat to buy. So I just encourage families to do as much research as you can. Come out and talk to people like me, who's a child passenger safety technician. There's a lot of us in the metro area, a lot of us in the state of Minnesota, a lot of us in surrounding states. You can find resources on Minnesota's website, buckleupkids.mn.gov, and just connect with one of us, and we'll help you out.
When it comes to seats, I know that depending on the age, that will tell you what kind of seat to have. But does the brand or model of a vehicle determine which seat you need?
It all matters to an extent. So every seat will fit differently in different cars. So the two pieces of advice that we give everybody, or the two mandates, I guess, are always read your vehicle manual and always read your car seat manual. Your vehicle manual will tell you where they've crash tested car seats, meaning they will tell you where they want or where it's okay to put those seats in the vehicle. And then your your child seat manual will tell you how to install it in a vehicle. And so both of those sort of matter. And what I usually recommend to families is if you go to a retail store, just ask them if you can take one of their display models out to your car to make sure it fits right, to make sure that you understand how to install it in your vehicle before you spend, sometimes hundreds of dollars on these seats. You want to make sure that it's going to work for you.
I want to go back to the 90%. If that many people are incorrectly installing seats, or that many seats are incorrectly installed, what are the common mistakes across the board that you're seeing people are making with these seat installations?
It varies. A lot of times with the seat installation itself, it's not tight enough. Sometimes people are using the wrong belts or the belt system, and they might combine the seat belt and the lower anchor connectors. Every car seat now comes with these lower anchor connectors that are designed to make it a little easier to install. And families kind of understandably, but mistakenly, think that the tighter I get this car seat in, the better it is, right? So if you install with the seat belt and the lower anchors, it's probably going to be safer. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because you're kind of interfering with physics and the way that the crash forces interact with your car seat and the belt system. Some other misuses we see in terms of putting the child into the seat are the straps aren't in the right place. The strap should be at or below their shoulders if they're rear facing, or at or above their shoulders if they're forward facing. The chest clip is sometimes in the wrong place. That should be about at the armpit level. Sometimes just the harness straps aren't tight enough. A common misuse, especially in the great state of Minnesota in the winters, is putting kids in too bulky of clothing. Because even if you get that harness really tight with that big winter jacket on, the forces in a crash can still compress the fabric and the lining and the insulation of that coat more, and then kids are susceptible to slide around a lot more, or maybe even come clean out of their seat in a collision.
When you first get a seat, is it likely that it's coming as a baby shower gift from someone else? And if that's the case, is there a way for you to tell people through your registry that this is the seat I want? Or do you see a lot of people just happening to get whatever a relative or friend buys?
I think that's certainly the case for some families. That's how I hear about a handful of families receiving their seats, is they'll put it on their registry. And sometimes they're making decisions based on what matches their car interior and that sort of thing, and that's fine. But know that all child safety restraints in the United States are tested in the same way. And so what you're paying for with those seats is extra features. So a cheap seat isn't going to be any less safe than a really expensive seat. The manufacturer is just putting additional resources into that seat for comfort or for what they think is ease of use. What I would caution against is families who, obviously, seats are really kind of cost prohibitive in some cases. So families might look to friends, relatives, garage sales, that sort of thing, to find a used seat. And we really can't recommend that, with the exception of under a few circumstances. If a seat is, if you know the history of it, so it's never been in a crash, you're getting it from somebody reputable, a brother, sister, neighbor, somebody you know and you trust, you know that it's never been in a collision, you know that all the labels are there, you can access the manual. A lot of times those are available online now, so if it doesn't come with the seat, and that there's no wear and tear on the seat. Sometimes you'll see those little white marks on a seat. That means that the plastic is stressed, and the integrity of that plastic might not hold up as well in a crash. There's also comfort lining in the seats. There's styrofoam in every seat to absorb energy in a crash. Those things should all be intact. But always recommend families coming to look for have a child passenger safety technician take a look at a used seat if they have any concern about it.
And we get listeners from all over the world, but for some of our local listeners in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, where are some places they can go? I know we have clinics on a regular basis. What's your recommendation to them? And even I know that people can access this content years from now,
right.
But right now we're sitting mid to late April 2015. What do we have going on our car seat clinic calendar?
Well, we try to plan clinics. Right now we're doing about 8 a year, and there are a handful of other hospitals in the area that are doing a ton of clinics. There are private companies that are doing clinics. There are dealerships that do clinics. And so, not to be totally date specific, I think I could just direct people to the websites. There's 2 primary websites, and one of them I mentioned earlier is buckleupkids.mn.gov. And those you'll see a map of where all the technicians are. And so even if it's not an event, you might find a technician at a police station or a fire station or maybe a private company or a dealership, and you can schedule an appointment with that person. Otherwise, there's another website. Safe Kids Worldwide is the governing body or the certifying body of all child passenger safety technicians. And so in some cases, the separate individual state coalitions or regional coalitions will plan events. And so Safe Kids mn.org/events is another place to look for specific events about that are around car seat checkups.
You can also find it as far as car seat information on our website, childrensmn.org. Look under injury prevention, and we have a host of information there. Dex, you're our star. When it comes to rear-facing seats, what are the main features of a rear-facing seat? What are the main uses for a rear-facing seat?
This is one thing I want everybody to know. If I could talk to every parent, I would. And my advice would be to leave your kids rear-facing as long as possible. The data out there in terms of the injury sustained in a crash with a child rear-facing versus forward-facing are just astronomical. Kids are 5 times more likely to get severely injured if they're forward-facing too soon. Greater than 5 times. I only say 5 times because it's hard to compare data between different families and different kids in different situations. But a child rear-facing will be able to ride down the forces of the crash. That rear-facing seat will support their head, neck, and spine, and help divert the forces from the crash away from the child. In every crash, there's 3 actual crashes. First, the vehicle hits something, and then the human body hits something, and then there's the internal crash. So the vehicle hits something, that's your collision. You hit another car, you hit a tree, you hit a building. Hopefully not, but then your body's going to hit something, and hopefully what your body is hitting is a restraint, a seatbelt, an airbag. In the case of the kids, it's their child seat. It's the restraint that's on their child seat. But then I think a lot of people forget that the internal organs are still moving, and so the more we can protect and cradle the body throughout the course of a collision, the less likely the energy is to be transferred into internal organs. That's why properly fitting seatbelts and properly fitting restraints are so important, because they should be coming in contact with the strongest part of the body. So in the case of the 5-point restraint, it's the collarbone and then the hip bones. In the case of somebody who's just in a seatbelt, it's the collarbone and the hip bones. If a belt isn't fitting properly or isn't on tight enough, there's a hugely increased chance of injury. And in fact, a lot of European nations are actually requiring kids to be rear-facing until they're 4 or 5 years old, just because the data is so overwhelming in support of, keeping the kids safe.
When does it become impossible to stay in a rear-facing seat? Is it due to kids growing in height? Is it a certain age? When is it just... And is that the case? Does it become impossible at some point, or can you muster through all the way until a kid doesn't need to be in a seat?
There's a lot of things at play. So there's two different conversations we can have. First of all is the law, and kids have to be rear-facing until they're 1 year old and 20 pounds in the state of Minnesota. That's way too early to turn a kid around, but that's what the law says. You have to be rear-facing until you're at least 1 or 20 pounds.
And is that in place as is just as I don't want to say a bare minimum, but is that the law being put into place to say, okay, it would be absurd not to be rear-facing at this point, but really it should be, you need to be X amount of years old to be ultra safe?
I would say it is a bare minimum. And in fact, a law is a minimum standards, not, best practice. And so best practice is to keep kids rear-facing until they exhaust the height and or weight limit of their car seat. And every car seat's different. Most car seats will allow your kid to be up to 40 pounds, and the height differs on every one of them. But what we hear a lot is you put your kid in the rear-facing car seat, and their legs look kind of cramped against the back seat of the vehicle. That's really not a concern in terms of safety, because first of all, they're at a reclined position, and so they're sort of sitting at a regular seated position with their legs up on the seat. And this is in kind of an unprofessional medical opinion. Kids' legs are kind of jello-y in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, they can withstand a lot of abuse, as parents probably know, with their kids falling and jumping off of things all the time. But in the worst case scenario, we have such great, medical services that we can fix legs and neck, or legs and feet and that sort of thing. It just heads and necks are harder to fix, sometimes impossible.
Yeah.
They can be life-altering injuries.
Yeah, and you had mentioned about some seats being cost prohibitive to parents.
Mm-hmm.
When I worked in retail as a college student, I worked at a store that sold hockey gear, and we would get people who would be willing to spend $400 or $500 for a pair of ice skates. But if you showed them a helmet that was $100, they would balk at it and often look for the cheapest alternative. And I found that ironic. Would you recommend that, understanding that times are tough for many people, especially when it comes to raising children, affording children, to, if they can, do what they can to make sure you're getting the best possible seat? And it doesn't need to be a luxury model, like you said, that having these added features for, where it has a, an iPad stand and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But that if you're going to skimp on something, don't have it be on the seat.
Well, yes and no, because like I said, all car seats are crash tested in the same way based on government standards. The government, and by that I mean the body is the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, or I say NHTSA as an abbreviation. So NHTSA puts out the requirements for crash testing, but then it's up to the individual manufacturers to actually crash test their seats themselves. So sometimes those manufacturers will decide that they're going to do additional crash testing for one reason or another, but that expense gets passed on to the consumer. And so if you find the cheapest seat on the market, that seat is still crash tested by the same standards as the most expensive seat you can find. So totally appropriate to buy that seat. I would also encourage families who are struggling a little bit to ask your insurance. Certain insurance companies will offer grants. There's certain organizations around the state that might offer discounts or free seats. But just ask for help, because then we're having the hard conversation. Because do you spend the money up front to keep your kids safe, or do you risk substantial injury and medical bills and that sort of thing if they're not properly restrained?
How often are changes made in seats? Is it annually that something is found? Every once in a while you do hear in the news maybe a standard has changed, or usually it's when a recall takes place you hear something. But is it safe to say, no pun intended, that these are seats you recommend, or are you unable to do that because it may change from year to year?
It's really hard to recommend a seat, because a seat that works great in a Toyota might not work great in a Ford, and vice versa. It depends on your car. It depends on your situation. You might have 3 or 4 kids to transport, so then you might be looking at seats that have kind of a lower, a lower footprint, so you can fit 3 across the back seat of a sedan. And really, like I said, they're all crash tested the same, and every extra dollar that you're spending on those seats is going into the additional features. One thing you can look at is the NHTSA ease of use ratings. So the same governing body that mandates the safety standards also looks at all the seats that are on the market, and they make their own determination about how easy they are to use and install. So that resource is available as well. But like I said, it's really specific to family and what each family's specific needs are.
Correct me if I'm saying this question wrong, but who are the best candidates for front-facing seats?
Kids who can be front-facing are children who have outgrown the weight limit or the height limit on their rear-facing seat. For example, my daughter's 2.5 years old. I have a rear-facing, and the seat that we have, she can be in until she's 40 pounds or till she's 37 inches long. Well, right now she's 36.25 inches long, so she's almost there, but she's only 30 pounds. So when she outgrows one or the other, then it's time to move her around, turn her around to forward-facing.
And then roughly how long is a child in a front-facing seat if you go by the best possible standards with height and weight before they move into the booster seat, which is the booster seat, the next step after front-facing seat?
Right. So after you exhaust the height and weight limits on a rear-facing seat, you're going to do the same thing on your forward-facing seat, because you want to keep them in that 5-point restraint as long as possible. And by that I mean the harness, because it contacts their body in 5 different places. That's why it's called a 5-point restraint. it's safer. It spreads out crash forces across the larger part of their body. And if you're a fan of racing, you'll see the type of restraint that they use. And those are folks that know they're likely to get in a crash, and so they want to be as safe as possible.
I love those harnesses too.
I think we should all wear them, really.
I was getting my oil change, or not my oil change, I was getting my snow tires taken off the other day, and I was talking to the gentleman at the store, and I told him that if I could, when getting a car, request the bucket seats with the harness seatbelts, and I'm not a speed demon or anything like that. I'm not a racing enthusiast, but I love just that look. I want that for my driver's seat.
Yeah.
So you get those harnesses for the front-facing seat. Keep them in for, as you said, as long as you can.
Yep, there will be height and weight limits on all the seats. And if you don't have a height limit on your seats, know this: a rear-facing, their head has to be within an inch of the top of the shell. So as soon as their head, you can see less than an inch of the shell, behind their head, then it's probably time to turn them around. On a forward-facing seat, it's a little bit different. Their head can go up above the top of the shell, but as long as their ears don't go over the top of the shell, then they're still well within the height limit of that seat. But yeah, keep them in the 5-point restraint as long as possible, and then keep them in a booster until they're at least 4 feet 9.
Okay, and you don't recommend phone books when it comes to booster seats,
Absolutely
right?
Not. No.
I should sit on one still to this day as a driver. But
I know a lot of adults that probably could use a booster seat,
but not a phone book.
Yeah.
So then, booster seats, is it just what I'm picturing at a restaurant with just the kind of the bucket?
Sort of, but they have to meet the same crash test standards that every other car seat does. So even though they don't have a belt system on them, some of them don't, they still have to meet those crash test standards. There's also flammability standards. There's the materials that can be in the car seat. So that's I say crash test standards a lot. But that's only just it's a major part, but it's only a part of what the mandates are in terms of the safety equipment.
It's not necessarily just protecting from the impact.
Right.
There's a lot of post-impact safety that needs to be taking place.
So what you're thinking of is pretty. It just raises the child up, so the belt fits them in the right place. There are a couple of different types of boosters. Some of them have a back on them, some of them don't. It's a common question I get. Should I get a booster seat with a back on it, or should I just get one of the ones that they just sit on? And that, again, really depends on your needs. The benefit of having a back on the booster seat, number one, is they usually come with a belt positioning guide, and so that brings the shoulder belt down a little bit farther, making sure that it's going to fit right. And number two, if you don't have a headrest, you definitely need a back on the booster, because you want to make sure that the child's head and neck are supported all the way up. If you have really tall seats, maybe you don't really need the back on it, but that definitely provides some extra support.
When you're in a vehicle like a van where you have multiple levels of back seats, is there a particular seat that is best for your child safety seat? Is it that middle row, or again, is it just so dependent on the model that you really can't make a determination that, it's definitely this seat?
It's partially dependent on the model, but probably primarily dependent on the family's needs. So if you're just talking strictly about the safest place in a vehicle, the safest place in any vehicle is the point that's farthest away from any possible impact. So like in a sedan, for example, it's the rear middle seat. In a van, it's a little bit trickier because there usually isn't a middle seat right in the middle of the van. But, do families want to be crawling over each other to get a seat installed or get a child into a seat, that sort of thing. So then it really depends on the family's needs. But the safest position is just the farthest point from any possible impact on the vehicle.
How about keeping a child in the back seat? When is the point that it's okay for a child to ride in the front passenger seat?
So if you look at the crash statistics, you're most likely to get impacted in the front, followed by a rear impact. So those are the two top likelihoods of getting in a collision. So with front impacts being the most likely, you want to move the kids farther away from that, so a back seat is safer for sure. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Not the least of which is the airbag. And let me ask you a question. So quiz time.
I'm all
right?
for it. Yes.
When an airbag is deployed, the time, whether or not it's deployed is vehicle dependent. A lot of vehicles nowadays will have a sensor on them. So it might be a 15 mile an hour crash. It might be a 30 mile an hour crash. But when that bag deploys, It comes out of the dash. Do you have any idea how fast it's coming at your face?
I think I heard somewhere like 200 miles per hour.
That's the average.
Okay.
200 miles an hour. An airbag fully inflates in 20 milliseconds.
That's incredible.
So even though it's just a bag full of gas and air, that can still hurt a lot.
Yes.
And crash test standards, I believe I read somewhere where most crash tests are performed both on the 5th percentile female, which is about a 100-pound female, and the 95th percentile male, which is about 217-pound male. And so they'll do airbag testing and crash testing on both of those crash test dummies. So if you think about where a child would fit into that, they're probably not going to quite meet that 5th percentile female. Most of them won't. So the airbag is going to hit them in a totally different place than it would an adult. And at 200 miles an hour, anything that's hitting you at 200 miles an hour can cause some serious, serious injury.
And I think what also needs to be taken into account in those cases is, does the child have anything in his or her hands? Is there anything that would strike them in the face that would add to it? I know when people drive, it's encouraged not to have your hand on the top of the wheel. If you're wearing rings of some kind, that could come back and strike you. I can imagine with a child, things are going on, you're holding a mobile device.
Right.
That would only add to the
feet
impact.
Up on the dash,
yes.
They're not paying attention.
Yes.
So the general recommendation is kids who are about 13, we say keep them in the back seat till they're 13 at least. But again, everybody's different. I mean, every family's needs are different, and every child is different. So what we're thinking about is the maturity of the child. Can they sit still? Can they not disrupt the driver? Can they not, can they keep their phone away? Can they keep their iPad away? Can they keep their games away, in their pockets or whatever? Can they keep their legs off the dash or out the window? We don't want to see those types of things happening.
No.
And then really is the seatbelt fitting right? So if you have a child in the front seat, move that seat back as far as you can. They should be at least 22 to 24 inches away from the dash to give plenty of space for that airbag to deploy. But yeah, it really depends on whether or not that child is going to maintain their own responsibility and then not distract the driver.
How often do you see recalls taking place with seats?
Relatively regularly. A lot of the recalls we see are not necessarily fatal recalls, meaning that the whole seat will fail in a collision, but it's a usability sort of thing. Like one of the most recent recalls that people may or may not remember is a certain brand was recalled all of their buckles. Because after a while, kids can be kind of messy, and if you let them have juice and snacks and stuff in the car, some of that sticky stuff gets down in the buckle and makes it hard to release.
Are there any seats that come with the Oreos already, or the Cheerios already spilled in the seat?
I haven't seen any, but I think that would cause additional problems for family, yeah. I think my daughter's plenty good at putting... My daughter somehow got money into the shell of her seat. I have no idea how she did it, and I have no idea how to get it out.
That I was going to say, if you can get it, that's yours. Finders
Yeah,
keepers.
I'm pretty sure she stole it from me to begin
Does she have
with.
a part-time job she hasn't told you about?
No, there was a while where I had to pay her to go to daycare. So it was every time we got ready for daycare, she said, "Dad, I need money."
This could be a separate podcast episode.
She is. No, I think she's a very good entrepreneur.
That increases your daycare costs
It does.
significantly.
By a penny a day.
Oh my goodness. Is it crazy to think that, and they might already do this, I don't know. If car manufacturers develop vehicles with car seats for kids already installed, I'm picturing something where you can, once the child is old enough, you just remove the seat entirely and replace it with an adult seat. Is that conceivable? Does that happen? Or is it just simply some car dealers or manufacturers partner with developers of these seats where, hey, you buy this van, you get this child safety seat with it?
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up because there used to be cars that were made with integrated seats in them. The challenge with those is there's a couple of things. First of all, they're usually not adjustable. So it's kind of like a one size fits one. So your child may or may not fit appropriately in that integrated seat. The other thing we have to think about with all car seats is expiration date. And I think that's one thing that confuses families sometimes. Seats really expire? Really? Well, they do. And a lot of, if not otherwise posted in the seats, it's 6 years is the general standard. Some car seat manufacturers will tell you can use their seat for 9 to 10 years. You'll see those seats that are like the all-in-one or the 4-in-1 or whatever they call them, where it starts out as an infant seat, and then that child can stay rear-facing for a decent amount of time. Then it turns into a forward-facing seat. Then it turns into a belt positioning booster, and then it just turns into a regular booster seat. And those seats can usually be used for a little while longer than 6 years. But here's the things we're thinking about. First of all, there's forces on that belt path of your car seat. And so depending on the forces that are enacted on your car, or just by tightening the seat itself repeatedly over and over and over again, you could be stressing out the plastic. And as soon as the plastic is stressed, the integrity drops dramatically and its effectiveness drops. The other thing is the weather, and especially if you live in an area where the weather changes a lot, you have a lot of expansion and contraction. Do you happen to know what one of the primary ingredients in plastic is?
No.
It's petroleum. And so what happens when you heat up petroleum?
It expands?
It kind of evaporates.
Oh,
right?
okay.
So have you ever had
You
that
could tell
film?
I didn't go into science.
Well, that's fine. But have you ever had that film kind of on your windshield? You kind of wonder where that comes from?
Yes.
That's basically the petroleum and the plastic in your dashboard kind of evaporating and then sticking up onto your windshield. Car seats are no different. So after the course of time, they start to break down. In addition to that, there's the belts on the car seat. There's the padding in the car seat. There's the styrofoam insulation on the car seat. So all those things can break down after a while for any car seat, but poses particular problems for an integrated seat that you can't really remove.
And I imagine places like Minnesota where you get 140-degree swings in temperature, that can really mess with the integrity of a car seat.
Yeah.
Is it crazy to think that there can be a problem with kids getting to a certain age or awareness level where they are undoing the harnesses, undoing the belts? Have you run into that problem as a parent, or have you heard of people running into that problem with kids keeping it on?
I hear about that all the time. Yeah. A lot of times there are things that we can help with as child passenger safety technicians, and we can advise. So if that's the case, I would encourage families to seek one of us out and ask us questions. Sometimes it's a matter of contacting the manufacturer. They have maybe a different buckle that they'll give to you or sell to you that would be harder to release. Sometimes they have kind of rubber devices that go along the straps that make the chest clip harder to press down. I never recommend like duct taping the buckle in or padlocking it in.
Duct tape usually is the answer to most problems, but not all problems.
Not in this case, no. No, I don't recommend any home remedies if your child's escaping from their seat. Sometimes, and this is another tough conversation to have with parents, and I know myself as a parent, but sometimes it's just a matter of discipline. And I'm not saying disciplining your child, but I mean telling them, we can't go unless you're buckled, or we can't, whatever your incentive is, and just teaching them that it's important to stay buckled. And because sometimes kids, they're not unbuckling because they're uncomfortable, they're unbuckling just because they can. And that happens a lot with a lot of different things, as parents will know.
Can you walk me through the proper installation? I know that it probably would help to provide a visual, which we will, when we post this podcast, we will, provide other information for people to use. But you're talking about whether it's a first-time parent or maybe it's any parent who has questions or wants to make sure he or she is doing this right. How do you properly install that seat? And since I'm leaning towards somebody asking for the first time, it's that rear-facing seat.
Sure. All right. And the other population is we have a lot of other caregivers like aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa, who it's maybe been a while since they've had to think about restraining their own children or using a car seat of their own. So talking about installing a rear-facing seat, first of all, you want to check your what?
I was going to say check your mirrors, but no.
No.
You want to check...
I said it earlier.
The anchor?
No, you want to check of the vehicle and the car seat. What are we looking at first?
I think I was drinking my water at that point.
Okay, we're checking the manual first.
Yes.
Of both.
Which you can find online sometimes.
You can find them online sometimes, and if you're a nerd like me, I actually have them downloaded onto my phone. So if I ever need to access them again, I don't need to dig through a file drawer. They're right on
What
my
you
phone.
call a nerd, I call smart. That's just smart.
So you check your manuals first to make sure that it's okay to install the car seat in a certain position in your vehicle. A lot of vehicle manufacturers after 2003 will have these lower anchors that I talked about earlier, but they're only required to have them in two positions, so they end up being in those outboard positions. Well, if you want to consider the safest place for your child, in this case your newborn, it's going to be the rear or the center seat. So you might not be able to use those rear anchors or those lower anchors for a child in the center seat. You'll have to check both your vehicle manual and your car seat manual to make sure that it's okay. There's sizing criteria in terms of how far those anchors can be apart. In some cases, vehicle manufacturers will add a third set of anchors, or they'll add a fifth anchor where you can use two of one and then two of another, but not the third one on the other one. It gets a little confusing, but your manual will be able to answer all those questions for you. So whether you install your car seat with the lower anchors or with the seat belt, they're both just as safe. But I encourage families to use whichever method is the easiest, that they're most comfortable with, that they know that they're going to do right every time, every ride. And I do recommend you check every once in a while, because you install it once, it might loosen up, the weight of the kid. The cushion in the seat could compress. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. So you install the car seat either by the lower anchors or the belt. And when you grab it where that belt goes through the car seat, it shouldn't move more than an inch from one side to the other or away from the car seat. It can move a little bit. It can't move more than an inch. And then in a rear-facing seat, you want to make sure that the back of that car seat, so where the child's head would be, isn't coming in contact with the vehicle seats. Because there we do want it to move. If the seat is moving there, that's what's going to help absorb or divert some of that energy in a crash away from your child.
And are there any differences for the front-facing install?
The front-facing install is just the same. If you have a convertible seat, though, meaning one that can be both rear-facing and forward-facing, it'll have two sets of instructions. It'll have a set of instructions complete with a separate weight and height limit for a rear-facing, and then a set of instructions with a different height and weight limit for forward-facing. So you want to make sure you're using the right belt path. You're not putting it through the rear-facing belt path when it's forward-facing or vice versa. But the installation is similar. You don't want it to move more than an inch side to side when you grab it at the belt path. Forward-facing seats add an additional safety measure called a tether strap, and you should always connect that when possible. And again, consult your vehicle manual. Sometimes they'll want you to route it underneath the head restraint. Sometimes it'll have to go over the head restraint. Plus, you'll also have to figure out where all those tether anchors are, and sometimes they're tough to find in vehicles. But that tether strap will help reduce the forward excursion of the car seat and your child's head in a collision by as many as 4 to 6 inches. When we're talking about force, 4 to 6 inches is a huge amount of space to save, head and neck movement.
Is it recommended that a parent take the car seat into the home between rides when you get home, or is it to be left in the car at all times, most of the time? And if it is left in the car, should you check before each ride that everything is secure?
I always recommend checking before each ride. It's okay to leave them in the seat in the cars. The exception, I think, would be the infant seats. So they have the carrier, and sometimes they have an attached or a detachable base. And usually you can install those seats either with or without the base. And there should be instructions on that, or you talk to one of us, our child passenger safety technicians.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off there.
Go ahead.
I did. What are some of the questions that you hear parents coming up with frequently, whether it be general questions about car seats, or what are some of maybe the myths that you hear, or commonly incorrect information being shared by parents or other people?
It's a really confusing kind of area, so there's a lot of things that can be misleading to families. One of the things that we see a lot of are aftermarket products, and by that I mean anything that doesn't ship with your car seat. So those things that dangle from the handle, those little toys, the mirrors that hang from the back seat, or the window shades that you clip over your window. One of the popular ones that we really discourage are the inserts that go in and around the car seat and then zip up over baby. Anything that adds padding in between the restraint and the car seat other than your child could affect the way that the harness works in a crash. So we don't recommend anything being inserted behind the harness other than your child. And then the general rule of thumb is nothing thicker than fleece. So if you put your child in a fleece coat, then you can bundle them up after you get them bundled into the car. So you secure them in the harness, and then you can wrap some blankets around them. Or if they're a little older, you can put their coat on backwards. They think it's kind of cool to get to, put their coat on backwards, put their arms through the sleeves.
That was me in the early 90s when crisscross was popular. But that
Same, yeah.
That's good to know, though, because I think generally people would think more padding equals more protection, when in the case it could completely compromise the purpose of the seat.
Yeah. You and I as drivers shouldn't even really be wearing those thick coats, because all of that insulation is basically just air. It's, like little fluffy things surrounded by air. The air and that insulation is what keeps us warm.
That's why I go everywhere with a tank top. That's it. That's all I wear.
Well, there are other reasons for that, showing off the guns all the time, right?
Yeah. I know you got to get out of here, but is there anything else that you'd like parents to know, or in my case, other caregivers? I'm an uncle of a soon-to-be 4-year-old. I've taken him places before without his parents, and of course it's with his parents' permission, but I've taken their car. They have put him properly in his seat. They've shown me how to get him back into his seat when we are on our return trip to the house. But what if I want to take him somewhere, but I want to drive my car? Other than going through the steps of the manual and everything, are there any other things that I would need to know as a once-in-a-while caregiver to a child?
Well, know that the seat might not fit the same way in your car as it does in theirs, depending on the model of the car. So it's something you want to check out before the planned trip. You want to just, take a day and test it out. Just make sure you're comfortable installing it yourself. But totally okay to move it from car to car. That's all right. I think one of the biggest challenges that there's a couple of different schools of thought. There's parents that want to do everything possible to prevent injury to their child, and then there's parents that think, well, I don't want to go crazy, and this is just silly to be thinking about all this stuff. But I'm kind of in the latter camp, even though I'm the injury prevention program coordinator here at Children's. I think it's okay for my daughter to kind of explore her space, get hurt every once in a while. She falls, cuts and scrapes, that sort of thing. That's part of the learning process. But something like a car crash could be a life-altering thing. And so I really encourage families to kind of take this seriously and think about what's happening in a crash. What are the energy forces at work? And we're really powerless against the forces of a crash. If you think about our old buddy Isaac Newton, so he said that the force required, the restraining force in this case, is equal to the mass times the acceleration. So the physics is a little wonky, but if you think about somebody like me who's 230 pounds, and maybe I'm going 30 miles an hour.
You wear it well, Dex. I would have never
right.
guessed.
You take my weight times the speed, and that's how much restraining force is required. For a child, like my daughter, who's 30 pounds in a 30-pound crash, or I'm sorry, my daughter is 30 pounds in a 30-mile-an-hour crash, that's a ton of force that's required, and her tiny body can't handle that on her own. She needs help. And so that's why we want to make sure that we keep her restrained. And the biggest challenge is you don't know what you don't know. I mean, you can go through life misusing something or, not being the safest possible and never have any injury come about yourself. And so it's that kind of complacent, sort of relaxed feeling that you get like nothing's ever going to happen. But, why not take the extra couple minutes just to make sure that you have everything installed right, that you're following the instructions, and that your child is safe.
I appreciate you coming on and providing this information. This is extremely valuable to parents and caregivers of all kinds, and I look forward to talking to you again on other topics around injury prevention, and of course seeing you at the State Fair this year.
Yeah, look forward to. Hey, I'm glad to have you back, so feel free.
Thanks, Dex.